there was ever a time when you should give credit properly, it's when discussing the Megillah. We learn from the Megillah how important it is to always give credit to the source of information, because in the Megillah story, one of the things that saves the day is that when Mordechai overhears the plot against the king, he tells Esther about it, and Esther tells the story to Achashverosh in the name of Mordechai. So later on, when the king can't sleep, right, and he's reading the Chronicles and he wants to know, is there somebody that I have a debt to that's why I can't sleep? What do I have to do? He says, it was Mordechai. Because, well, how do we know this? Because Esther told him, Mordechai told me. Right? So from this we learn that salvation is actually part of giving proper credit to an individual. So tonight we're going to be learning from Rav Brevda, and he bases most of his work on the work of the Vilna Gaon and Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi, his book called Yosef Lechach.
His name is Ashkenazi?
His name is, Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi, right? So that's what we're going to be working from.
Cool.
And I want to just go through some important principles that are laid out in the story. First of all, Rav Brevda points out that one of the most important lessons we learn from the Purim story is the nature of behavior. We have the behavior of two tzaddikim, right? Esther Hamalka, Esther the queen, Hadassah, right? And Mordechai. And on the other side, we have the behavior of two of the worst Rishoyim in history, right? Achashverosh and the evil Haman, the viceroy, the prime minister. When you look at just simply their midos, you get a great understanding of what our behavior should be. Esther and Mordechai are put under tremendous, excruciating pressure, not only for their own lives, but they feel responsible for the lives of the entire Jewish nation. And I'm not talking about the Jews of Persia. The 127 provinces that Achashverosh ruled was really the entire Jewish world.
They all were there?
Yeah. So
this is after the time they're not in Israel anymore, right? Or
that's right. Nebuchadnezzar had taken them to Babel. But wherever they were scattered throughout the world, they were still under the Persian throne, right? Which was 127 countries. They were like 127, we could call them governors, but they were really like individual kings. If you notice, things are sent out in many languages, right? The scribes write the letters in many languages because they're actually different nations that Persia is ruling.
But they all could say back to him, right? To Nebuchadnezzar, who runs everything, or Ashkenazi.
Yeah, they all had to answer back to Achashverosh. Yeah. Right? So what was at stake for Esther and Mordechai was not simply their own death or the death of their families or the death of their countrymen, but really the destruction of all of the Jewish world, right, had Haman succeeded. In spite of that, the phrase that one might use is they were cool as a cucumber. You never see them getting panicky, right? Esther at one point says, I don't think this will work, to Mordechai. When he said, you have to go to the king, she says, the king sees people at his request, and he hasn't requested me. I could be killed if I go, right? It's not a question of fear, it's a question of the mission won't succeed. She's pointing it out. And Mordechai says, you have to go. And she says, okay, everybody has to fast and prepare so that I have all the prayers of the Jewish people with me when I go to the king. But you never see her crying and, how could God do this to me? What's going on? There's no self-pity. There's none of that, right? It's a sense that God is running the world, right? And we have to work within God's plan, and whatever it will be as God chooses, which will be for the good. Same is true for Mordechai. At one point, he sits, and tears his clothes, and he's mourning with ashes, but still with dignity. He always has dignity. What's on the other side? On the other side are people who are nuts. You know, the most powerful man in the world is Achashverosh. The second most powerful man is Haman. Haman is never happy. He's always dissatisfied. He always feels, I don't have enough. It's whatever, right? He has more than anybody else. He's the richest man in the kingdom, right? But he always feels like, you know, there's this one person who doesn't bow to me. My day is ruined. I can't live with it, right?
Can't live with it.
You can't live with it, right? Achashverosh is constantly worried about plots. He has to be a big man on campus, right? I because I married Vashti, you know, now she thinks that I'm nothing. I'm a stable boy, right? Now this comes from the fact, perhaps, that these two most powerful men were a stable boy, a guy who cleaned out, you know, horse poo from the stable on one side, and the other side was a hairdresser. No offense to hairdressers, right, and barbers, right? You know, which was Haman. So maybe they felt a great need to prove themselves to be at a certain level, right? Where clearly this was not a problem for Mordechai, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, and for Esther, descended from the throne of Shaul HaMelech, from Binyamin. So they were composed in who they were. They knew who they were. This is a very basic lesson of the whole Megillah, is to understand that if you have emunah, if you have an understanding that Hashem runs the world and you are who you are, then panicking is only taking the position that God doesn't know what He's doing. And that's a big mistake. Right? So, and we are tested, right? And we're tested in a way that makes us lean towards panicking. Right? That's part of the test, right? But when we look at the behavior of Esther and Mordechai, we should come to understand that this is not the way, and that this will accomplish nothing. So this is the basic overview of the whole story, is to understand the difference in the midos between Mordechai on one side, Mordechai and Esther, and Achashverosh and Haman. And you see it in their behavior all the way through, in each event. You know, they're scurrying around, the two evil people, right? And Mordechai and Esther are confronting problems, very, very serious problems. But they're doing it with an emunah. They know that Hashem is pulling the strings. They know that He's tightening the screws, that He's changing things, that things are going on. And they have a confidence, even though they may not understand exactly how it's happening, that this is what's going on. So that's the main lesson we should take from this. Right? And it applies at all times. The second lesson is that we should know the difference between the punishment that Yidden have and the punishment that people who are not Jewish have. If God decides that the Gentiles are deserving of punishment, the punishment can be very severe. And we see lists of destructions of great nations. You know, where are the Babylonians? Where are the Assyrians? We know all this, right? The difference for us, and by the way, there are exceptions to this rule. We know that the Assyrians, because of Yonah, was spared. But on the whole, when a nation is deserving of a severe punishment, right, they get it. You know, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which was the greatest nation in the world, became literally a backwater. Wow. You know, for 500 years, who was Spain? Right? They were the greatest power in the world. And Portugal, the great explorers. In your lifetime, what was Spain? Nothing. Yeah, and it's true for hundreds of years. Right? When God decides to punish these nations, right, it's pretty severe. But when He decides to punish the Jews, that because the punishment is needed, right, just as a punishment can be needed for a child, in order that he will learn and improve as time goes on, it's done with love and with pain. And the most important thing to always know is that the cure for the illness is in place before the punishment. And that's another very important lesson of this. It's the idea of the makkah and the refuah. The makkah is the plague, the pain, right? The Makos of Egypt, right? And the refuah is the recovery. So in this case, let's look at it, right? That Haman was going to come on the scene and hatch this evil plot, right, was going to happen. Before that, right, all the things happened before that, right? Vashti married the stable boy, right? The stable boy became king. The stable boy wanted to have a throne like Solomon, the greatest king of all time, right? And so he built it in Shushan, but turns out they don't have wide loads. They have trucks that say sign wide load. They didn't have that in Persia in those days. So rather than move the throne to Babel, he said, I'm the emperor. I'll move the government to the throne. Right? That's what he did. The whole government moved to Shushan. Why?
Okay.
So that it's a deacon. So that Esther and Mordecai shouldn't have to get on a bus and go to Babel to solve this problem. Right? We'll bring the kingdom to them. Right? The Rasha can work hard to do everything so that things are not too difficult. But that was in place. It was moved to the doorstep of Mordecai. Wow. Right? The whole empire was, right? Then they had this big party, right? And there's a concept, atzos. Let me just find it here for you. I want to say it correctly. It's a very important concept throughout the story. Atzos Hashem. It's a process in which God, atzos, makes people think in a way that they would not normally think. It would seem illogical. If you have gotten the credibility of your kingdom by marrying the granddaughter of the greatest emperor of all time, Nebuchadnezzar, the last thing you want to do is kill her. Right? I'm the king. I'm a stable boy. Right? She's royal blood. The daughter of Belshazzar, the granddaughter of the great Nebuchadnezzar, right? She's mine. And by the way, she's beautiful as well. Right? Okay, she can be a little irascible at times, right? A little bit shrewish, right? But she's my ticket to credibility in the rest of the world. Because, I don't know how to speak properly. I don't know, all the etiquette. She knows. She grew up with this. She's my ticket, right? And by the way, she needs me because I'm the emperor. So we have a contract. It works, right? You would kill her? You would kill your ticket? Doesn't make sense, right? And yet, for reasons that are almost impossible to fathom, that's exactly what he does. He asks her to do something that normally she wouldn't mind doing. That she would show off her beauty, that she wasn't a modest person. She was an immodest person. She chose to have her party not in the women's quarters, but in the one private chamber that belongs to the king himself. Right? Not even in the general palace area, but into the private chambers that only the king would use. Right? This created a great deal of possibilities for immodest mingling, because it was so close to the man's party. Right? But she did that intentionally. She wanted to let him know, I have control here. That he felt she was the most beautiful woman in the world and a trophy that he would show off to his ministers, it's kind of understandable. That she would resist it is sort of strange, because she didn't mind prancing around as it was, because she knew how beautiful she was, and she wasn't a modest person. But he asks her in an appropriate way, and God strikes her, it says, with saras, and maybe with a tail, whatever. And but whatever it was, she decided that she was, it was a bad hair day. She wasn't looking right, and there was no way that she was going to obey the request of the king. And she tells him in a way that is extremely unpleasant. What does she say to him? She said, my father would invite 1,000 guests to a feast. And with each guest, he would have a drink.
Oh my.
He would say l'chaim.
That's a lot of drinking.
Right? And he would never get drunk.
Oy.
But you, the stable boy, have a couple of drinks and you act like this, like a drunken bum? What kind of man are you?
Yeah. She knows how to poke, right?
What had he done? He had created a party that went on for half a year, 180 days, to establish his nobility, his power, his wealth with everybody in the kingdom, all the leading characters in the kingdom. Right? And what does Vashti do? She reminds him he's a stable boy. She cuts the legs out from under him. Right? Why would she do it? It also doesn't make sense, right? He's her breadwinner, her ticket to success. Without it, she's the daughter, of a deposed king. She could be a dead person, right? Instead, she's the queen of 127 provinces. What's the big deal? Okay, he wants you to dance, without many clothes on, right, in front of his ministers. You're not a modest person. What's the big deal? Right? There's no issue. Right? For some reason, she makes it a federal case. She's willing to stake her life on it, right? And eventually lose it. So these are strange behaviors. Let's come back to so all of these things were in place before we hear the name Memuchan. Memuchan, who is a young advisor, the youngest of the advisors. It sits in a court of the king. When Vashti doesn't respond to the king and he's upset, he decides he has to do something about it. Now, there's a law in Persia that if you did something that was a cause of national security, the king could have you killed without any discussion. Right? But if the issue was simply an insult to the king, let's say you addressed the king before he addressed you. That's an insulting thing to do to a king. The king couldn't say off with your head. He actually had to take you to court and say they insulted the throne and he should be killed. This law was instituted in the previous administration, and it was instituted to protect the ministers, so that the ministers could give good advice to the king without endangering their lives. Because we see it with presidents and with cabinets. We see it with prime ministers. We see it with intelligence organizations. All too often, they want to tell the leader what he wants to hear. But that's not necessarily the good advice. Sometimes the good advice is, Mr. President, I know that you don't want to take an aggressive stance, but unless you confront the enemy, right, we will go past the point of no return and they will be able to destroy us. So you must act now. This is something the president may not want to hear, but all he can do is fire his head of the CIA. Right? In those days, you could kill a person for giving you the wrong advice. So the minister of Persia had a policy that if it's just an insult, right, if he's offended that you gave him this advice, right, you had to take him to court. Even the king had to take him to court. So now the king has to take Vashti to court. Right? Well, he doesn't have to. He could say it's an issue of national import. Right? But he doesn't want her to die. Right? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu does want her to die. Because she has to make way for Esther.
Yeah, she has to be out of the picture, right?
That's right. So he goes to court, and he has a choice of two courts. One court is a court that follows the letter of the law. A, B, C, whatever it is, you did it, you did the crime, you served the time. Right? The other one was a far more like a constitutional court. It had to interpret the law. So it could try to find compromises. Which court does he choose? He chooses the second one, because he doesn't want Vashti out of the picture. He loves his wife. He wants to keep his wife. He loves her. He doesn't love her.
And he feels sorry that he made this crazy.
Whatever the
situation.
reason is, whether it's a political decision or emotional decision,
Or he's finished from being
he's
drunk.
decided that she shouldn't be killed.
Yeah.
So he goes to the second court, the one that has the ability to make compromises, right? And he says, you know, I didn't ask her to dance for me. I sent a messenger. They asked. Right? So she didn't really insult me. It was a messenger.
A messenger, yeah.
And then he says, what should be done with Queen Vashti? He asked the court. Right? Now this is sending a signal to the court. Because up until now, she's referred to as Vashti the queen. She's Vashti who is the queen. Now he says, Queen Vashti. You should know that you're talking to King Achashverosh about his queen Vashti, right? The queen of the realm. He's sending them a signal. She didn't really do anything offensive, and by the way, she is the queen, right? Remember that. So he's assuming that the court will say, you know, Your Majesty, we really don't think that it's a requirement to destroy her. There's a way back from this brink. And as they're about to say it, there are 6 senior people there and one new person who's just started serving on the court, a young man, who says, Your Majesty, and his name is Memucan, which means he was ready. We later find out that he's also called Tommen. Says, Your Majesty, this is not simply an insult to you as a man, and that's bad enough. I know. Right? He's married to Zeresh. Right? He's a barber, right? Who Zeresh has made into a judge, right? His wife, Persian woman, one of the cleverest women in the empire. It's not simply an insult to you as a man, as a husband, but to the entire throne. And through the throne to every man in Persia. There's no question what has to happen to the queen. Sorry, but it's clear. In the end, everybody agrees. What happened? Haman is there to turn the screws. He's actually God's vehicle here.
Wow.
Right? He's making room. He is doing what is required. The refuah, which is Esther as the queen, and Mordechai as a trusted advisor, is all in place by the time Haman reveals himself as the evil person. Right? If Haman had revealed himself in his plot before she was queen, before he was a trusted advisor, before he had saved the day for the king, then things might have gone differently. So another lesson we have here is that before the illness, before the tragedy, before the difficulty, when we're dealing with God's firstborn, God always puts the recovery in place, the cure in place, the medicine in place. You know, now that doesn't necessarily mean that if a person is ill, they will always get better. You shouldn't misunderstand that, because it may be the refuah for the person is to go on to Olam Haba. That's not a refuah to the people who stay behind, but it may be for that person. But it's always in place for the Yid, right? Which comes back to the first point. Right? If you know that, if you know I'm having financial difficulties, and it seems very dark, right? I'm having a job problem, and it's very hard to handle. There is another job that has already been prepared. There is a different financial solution that is already in place. You can't see it, but it's already very neatly there. It's in a little package put aside. It's there, when you need it, right? Then, God will just reach into the drawer, take out that envelope, and pass it to you, right? That's what happens, right? And you never could have imagined. You could say, if I lose this job, if I don't, sell this stock, if I'm caught with this inventory, everything is finished, right? This is, again, the midos of Esther and Mordechai. They know this principle, that the refuah is in place before the makkah. This gives them a confidence to continue through it. What was the cause of the Gezerah, the decision of God to implement Haman's plot? The cause was two parts. One was that the entire empire was told to bow to Nebuchadnezzar. Not to Nebuchadnezzar, but to a statue he had built.
A statue of Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah. And in fact, it wasn't really a Avodah Zarah. It was to show subservience to the king, to the emperor. He was the most powerful man in the world.
This is before Asher's.
This is 2 generations before, right? There was Nebuchadnezzar, there was Belshazzar, and then there was Achashverosh. And there are some questions about some of the elements of history, how they come together there, and the Persian names and the Hebrew names. But basically, it was, they say, 3 kings ago. Nebuchadnezzar, the whole world knows about. He's the one who destroyed the base of English. He's the one who brought the Jews into final exile. Of that exile, that was the last stage of that exile itself. And he was a very powerful and very cruel person as well.
Was a cruel person.
Very cruel, very cruel. Just a side note: the reason that the party was 180 days was that Nebuchadnezzar had acquired the treasures of 1,080 nations of treasures. When I say treasures, I'm not talking about just wealth. You know, one of the great tragedies of the Shoah, the Holocaust, was that the Jewish people who were victims of the Holocaust, when they lost their lives, the possessions, the inherited possessions of the family, great works of art, beautiful things, were all confiscated by the enemy. And to this day, much of it has not been recovered.
Wow.
Much of it's not been recovered.
Billions of dollars.
Definitely. Billions of dollars. Right. And it's a tragedy because it really did belong, and it was a heritage going back many hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it fell into evil hands. And it hangs on walls of people who it doesn't belong to. There will come a time when it will all find its way back to where it should be, but it's a painful thing. Nebuchadnezzar, when he collected the treasures of the world, collected them for himself, that he would be the possessor of all the museums, so to speak. But he didn't want anybody else to have it. These were the most beautiful, most valuable things in the world. And so, what he did was he put all these treasures into 2 huge boats, huge ships, right? Made it entirely of copper. And then he flooded, when he gave instructions on his death, that a tributary of the Euphrates would flood these ships, and of course they're made of solid copper. They don't float, right? And they would sink to the bottom, and nobody would ever see the treasures again.
Oy.
And I don't want to spend too much time, but it's a bit of a story, but the person who had the merit to get these treasures back was Achashverosh.
Oh, okay.
And Achashverosh decided that a large part of Achashverosh's life was devoted to impressing people in who he was, right, and how important he was. And so, one of the things he did was to display the treasures, right?
The ones that never sunk.
That's right.
Okay.
These treasures, right? And these treasures, which, as I said, were 1,080 treasures, right? The treasures were so dramatic that to actually see each treasure was like a museum. Right? It wasn't like, here's a statue.
Yeah.
But it was like an entire display, a museum that it would take 6 days actually to learn about the treasure, the grandeur of the treasure. So if you spent non-stop, right, 6 days, right? Actually, let me just check this. So I think you could see. No, I'm sorry. You could see no more than 6 in a day. right? You could see 6 of these treasures in a day. If you spent the whole day viewing,
wow,
right, you could see 6 of them. So how long would it take you to see 1,080 treasures that were acquired by Nebuchadnezzar? 180 days.
180 days.
Right? That's what it comes down to. This is why the party was 180 days.
Oh, wow.
It was that he wanted everybody
to show off all these treasures.
to see all of his wealth, all of his magnificence. Achashverosh lived to make this impression. It's a very big part of his life.
Wow.
This impression. So, and we see this in many places. So, this was Achashverosh, right? And he had to be in place, as did Esther, as did Vashti, as did Mordecai, prior to the antagonist arriving on the scene. And of course, we know the whole story of how it happened, right? The sins that caused the Jews to find themselves in that position was that they bowed to the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had built. And even though it wasn't truly a Avodah Zarah, because Nebuchadnezzar didn't think it was a god, he thought, I want them to pay respects to me. Right? And that was the purpose of the bowing. Still, it was perceived as a Avodah Zarah, and a Jew shouldn't do that. Right? The second one was the Mishta, the feast that was held by Achashverosh. And Achashverosh went to a lot of trouble with this feast. Everything was glatt kosher.
Achashverosh made it kosher?
Everything was kosher. The wine was kosher. The meat was shechted by properly. Everything was done.
Why would he worry about that?
I'm glad you asked the question,
okay.
Right? Because Achashverosh was politically quite clever.
Oh.
The kings that had ruled before, right, were descendants of kings. And they ruled with a great confidence. Right? Achashverosh was a newcomer, nouveau riche, so to speak, nouveau royalty.
Nouveau
right?
royalty, yes.
And this was a theme throughout the story. It's why he built this fabulous throne, a copy of Solomon's throne. It's why he moved his capital to Shushan. It's why he married Vashti. Right? Because all these things were to make clear how credible he was as a king. But he did something else. He said, when I had the party for 180 days, the purpose was to impress the governors, the kings of my vassal nations, of my power, my wealth, my power, who I was, right? That they should fear me. Now I'm having a party for 7 days only for the people in Shushan. And it's very important that they not only have the sense of my power, but that they love me too. They should like me, right? Because if there's ever a coup, it's going to start here. And if my neighbors, if the people of Shushan don't care about me personally, I could be defeated in a coup. So I'm going to teach them to love me. I'm going to do something that no emperor in history has ever done. I'm inviting every person of Shushan to my party. It's natural to invite the officers, the mayor,
and every single citizen.
Even the professionals, the dentists, the doctors, the lawyers, the accountants, whatever, right? The Balabayas, the businessmen. But, Shlomi the beggar, right? The water carrier, right? The people who weren't all there, everybody, signs were posted everywhere in Shushan. The emperor invites all the citizens of Shushan to come to his banquet. Right? And more than that, he had a policy. His policy was very democratic. We would say that it was democratic. Right? He had a very famous motto that he had written above his seat. Right? The sign said, "Each and every man's request and desire shall be fulfilled."
Each and every man's request and desire
right?
fulfilled.
This included the water carrier and the guy who wasn't all there and everybody. Right? So this was a combination of two things. It was a sign of his greatness that he could fulfill anybody's wishes, right? That he had the wherewithal to do it, but also his kindness. That whatever it is you need, you want white wine, you have white wine. You want red wine, you want sweet, you want dry, you want fish, you want steak, you want chicken. You would like this woman, you would like that woman, You want to dress this way, you want to dress that way. Whatever it was that somebody requested of Achashverosh, I will provide that of you. Right? And more than that, if your etiquette isn't perfect, I won't be so insulted. Right? For instance, if I make a toast and you don't want to drink, you don't have to drink. People would be beheaded for not drinking when the king made a toast previously. Right? So this is interesting, but if you listen to it carefully again, right? It sounds very democratic. It's we hear things like this often from people running for office. Right? Each and every man's request and desire shall be fulfilled. Sounds like somebody, who could be running in the New Hampshire primary, right? Whatever it is you need, right? Yeah. We're going to give you more services for the government and lower taxes. Right? We're going to provide more, and it's going to cost you less. Right? This is what Achashverosh said. Now, the problem with this is that when politicians say this generally, they're just lying in order to get elected.
They're lying.
But Achashverosh was already elected. Right? So it wasn't about being elected.
Yeah.
He actually really believed that this was a good policy. Right? But of course, anybody who is serious about being a leader, take David HaMelech. Right? Great kings. Right? It's not each man's request, desire shall be fulfilled. It is what I, as the leader, judge to be in the best interests of my nation. That's how a good leader is.
Yeah, of course.
And if his judgment is good, he's rewarded by the success of his nation. Now, a Jewish king, it's a little bit different, right? Because what he's concerned about is that I fulfill the will of God. Because the will of God is, of course, in the best interests at that point. But it's not about, you want to have filet and you want to have, white meat and you want to have dark meat. It's, God doesn't want us to eat pork. You want to eat pork? Not in my house. Even if it's your will. This is how we run the ship. There is a way. There is a seder. There's a proper way to do this, right? Achashverosh said, whatever it is anybody wants, they'll get. Right? Now this leads to problems. And it led to problems very quick for him. Why? Because one minister said the Median women are the most beautiful. Another said the Persian women are the most beautiful. Another said the women of Babel are the most beautiful.
Arguing who's the most beautiful women.
And Achashverosh said, my wife Vashti is the most beautiful. They said, show us. Show us, right? What does the sign say above your head? It's our wish that you show us Vashti. Right? You said every man's request and desires be fulfilled. Show us Vashti. Right? That's our will. Right? You got to do it. He says, you're right, I have to do it. Right? He says to Vashti, Vashti, come and dance. She says, no. He says, you have to. She says, what does it say above your throne? My request is that I'm not dancing. Right? Now the king has the role of a king. Right? Because he can't fulfill both sets of requests. No. They are at loggerheads. It's impossible. So this concept of every man's request will be fulfilled is at its essence a failed policy for leadership. Right? And it's a failed policy for leadership that will eventually lead exactly where God wants it to lead to the death of Vashti. Right? So he became a prisoner of his own motto, so to speak, at that point, to quote Rabbi. Right? So he was moving to a head-on collision with her. Right? And the final, most painful thing was when she reminded him that he wasn't a king. That he was a stable
made a little bit
boy.
of a dig there.
It was a very deep dig, because it was his most sensitive. It was like an open wound, right? And she was like a teacher, saying, "Who do you think you are? Right? If you're a man, if you're a king, right, you don't fulfill the desires of people who talk this way to you. Even if you're drinking. My father would drink, as I said. My father would have a drink with 1,000 people, 1,000 drinks. He still wouldn't behave in such a way. He was saying, you're not only not a king, you're not even a man. Right? It was very painful. Right? And so he had to manage the situation, and as I said, he didn't want to kill her. Right? He didn't want to kill her. But Haman comes to our story with his own baggage. What's his baggage? You know, his strongest quality is that he is a very hateful person. Hate is an interesting quality because hate is not without its strengths, right? The desire for revenge is a very motivating desire for people. People often point out that love is less motivating than hate.
Well,
in terms of action. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's a sad phenomenon.
Yeah. That you would be more motivated to do something if you hate someone than if you love them.
And Haman, as we mentioned before, was the descendant of the final night of life of King Agag, who was be later killed in the morning by the prophet Samuel, cut to pieces. We read about it this week.
I like to call that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Right. That's right.
Story.
But it's really Texas Chainsaw Execution.
Execution,
as God had required it to be.
Yeah.
But before Agag was killed, he had impregnated. His seed had gone into a woman that would eventually be the ancestor of Haman. And Haman was born with hatred of everything Jewish, especially, I would guess, from the tribe of Benjamin, for reasons that Benjamin was from Saul. Right? Saul was from Benjamin. And so he had this burning hatred. Right? This was his strongest quality. He wasn't stupid, but mostly his burning hatred was a very motivating power. He was married to a woman who's considered to be one of the smartest women in the empire, Zeresh. So you have the stable boy married to the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, Achashverosh, and you have the hairdresser married to, I don't know, I don't want to name any names, but to the equivalent of a very brilliant political woman. You know, somebody who could have been Secretary of State or maybe even President. I don't know.
We don't know who you're talking about.
Who could it have been? Right?
Who could it have been?
You know, married to a former president.
I
don't know.
Man,
right?
I don't know. Might start with a C, but probably not.
But she was a very calculating woman,
yeah.
And she was determined to make her husband a great man. And she succeeded. He went from being a barber and a hairdresser to being one of the youngest judges on the political courts of Persia, which is tremendous. You know, it's one of the 7 most powerful people. And he would emerge shortly after that as the most powerful of all the ministers.
Well,
this was Haman. But Haman had the same problem that Achashverosh did. All this happened because of his wife. Nobody wants to be beholden to another person. You know? With your wife, you should have a partnership. Right? It shouldn't be she is the senior partner, you as a junior partner. It should be a proper partnership. Right? In Haman's case, Zeresh was running the show. Right? And if you combine his natural venom with the fact that now he owes it to her, right? It was a very, very difficult situation. I don't want to go through the whole story, but what I really wanted to do was kind of set up all the players as we read it, and we're going to see as we read it all the nuances unfold little by little, piece by piece. They fall into place. But all of these pieces, as they fall into place, we have to have in the back of our mind that these pieces were all there beforehand. The makkah is preceded by the refuah. The disease is preceded by the cure. We We just don't know it, right? And this is a very important thing for us to be conscious of as we go forward. God is not mentioned in the Megillah. There's no name of God in the Megillah. Or is there? We understand, Chazal tell us, that when we talk about King Achashverosh, that we're talking about a Persian king. But when we're talking about Hamelach, the king, right, then we're talking about God in here. So you watch for that when you're reading. That's what we're doing. The last point that I want to make, which I've said before, is the Purim story is a story about concealment. Right? Esther's name, Hester Panim, means a face is concealed. That when the temple stood, the first temple stood, right, God's face was revealed to us. There were constant miracles going on every day. By the time we get to Babel and the destruction of the temple, the Jews are wondering, are we still the bride of God? Or has God divorced us? Are we by ourselves? Right? And the woman that is chosen to be king, there's a play on her words. To the Persians, Esther means the star. But Hester means hidden, to be veiled. So, in the story of Purim, one of the things we can identify with, because we continue to live this way now, sadly, is that God's presence is veiled from us. If you are in a room, actually the best example is a relatively new invention over the last 10 years. There's an invention called the kosher lamp. Right? So what is the kosher lamp? It's a bright light bulb, right, in a canister, and on top of that canister is a second canister. And each canister has a window. And when the windows line up, there's a bright light that shines out of it. But when you turn one canister around, let's say this is the canister, and inside is a canister, and here's the window. When you turn it around so the windows are not lined up, the room is dark. So if somebody walked into the room when it turned this way, they would say, the light is switched off. There's no light. It's not true. The light is just as bright as when the windows are lined up, but nothing is getting out. It's veiled. It's hidden. Right? But it's there. The story of Purim is like the story of a kosher lamp when it's closed. Right? Is that the light of God is always there. Right? And it's clear that Esther and Mordechai know that. Even in the darkest moments, they know. But it's not revealed. Right? The fact that it's not revealed gives power to our enemies and saps power from us. Right? But we should always know that it's there. That all that has to happen is the windows need to line up and there'll be a bright light shining, because the light doesn't need to be switched on. It's there. One of the reasons that things are so well hidden in the Megillah is that the Megillah was going to be read to Achashverosh the next year.
That's cool.
Right? And to all the Persian people throughout the empires, it would be heard. Whether it was read in shuls, it was still not going to be a secret. It was a public reading everywhere. And the authors, Mordechai and Esther, who are now queen and prime minister, wife of the emperor, and the number one minister of the emperor, had to be very smart. That they would write a story that would convey God's involvement in the world to the Jews, and yet not insult the most powerful man in the entire world. Not portray him either to be stupid or to be evil. So it's a very fine line that's being walked here, and they walk it successfully. Because if you read the story, and people never do this, but if you read the story as though you are the Emperor Achashverosh sitting on your throne, and you're listening to the story, right? It's an interesting story, because I do the right things, says the Emperor. when I have the right facts, I act appropriately.
Yeah, he doesn't condemn the Jews. He actually helps it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I do what I can to do the right thing when I have the right information. And the fact that there was such an evil person around me, and that he had an evil wife who was manipulating him, and that I had an evil wife. It's understandable why some of these things could happen. Yeah. But me, I'm a good-hearted guy, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I was prepared to do the right thing. If you read the story through his ears, you can see it's not offensive. If you read it through the ears of the Jews, right, you can see what they were going through and how difficult it was, and what we continue to go through. So it's a very, very important thing to have this in mind as you're reading the story, because the story has tremendous depth, and we haven't even gotten to the point tonight of the unraveling of the plot. We've just gotten to the setup. Maybe next year we'll continue. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was the nature of the 4 major mitzvahs, and I wanted to do it briefly, but I wanted to cover it again. The first mitzvah is to hear the Megillah. The Megillah is the story of the events. You must hear it completely. You should listen carefully.
Why twice?
Right. Should hear it evening and night. You should hear it evening and day.
I don't remember the fact that it was a 2-day thing?
It wasn't a 2-day thing. By the way, it's an interesting. It was once pointed out to me by somebody that Purim is a unique holiday, right? Because when do we have the Seder? Right? The evening of the beginning of Pesach, right? Before the first day of Pesach, we have the first evening.
Yeah, that's right.
When do we have the first night of Sukkot?
Right? Before the first
Erev
day.
Sukkot.
Yeah.
Right. Same thing with Shavuos.
Yeah.
Right?
It's always the night
Same
before.
thing with Hanukkah. Same thing with everything. When do we have the feast of Purim?
It's the next night. It's the second
That's
night.
right. We have it in Mincha going into the evening.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's very unusual. Let's look at the holidays of the Gentiles. Right? When do they have Easter? On Sunday, Easter Day.
Oh, Easter Sunday.
Right.
Okay.
When do they have all their holidays? They have it on the day of the holiday. They don't have it Erev. They have one Erev holiday, actually.
Well, just for Christmas.
Actually, 2.
Christmas Eve.
They have 2.
Like that. Yeah.
Right. They have Erev Xmas.
Yeah, Xmas. Yeah.
And they have Erev New Year's. Right? These celebrate the birth and the bris of a Jew. Right?
Yeah.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
They celebrate the birth and the bris of a Jew. These 2 holidays. Right? I don't think anybody would argue that. Right? The story of Purim, right, is really the story of a major Gentile event and feast, and a whole series of things that are very kind of Gentile king is the center of the whole story. So we decided to have the holiday during the day, which is when there's right for Purim. It's an interesting. Yeah. It's like many things in Purim is like, why is it that way? But let's talk about this. So we have the Megillah evening and day. Right? Then we have 2 events during the day that are important, right? 2 events during the day are Matanos Avoyim, gifts to the poor. And when we give gifts to the poor, we want to make sure we give a gift that is enough for a person to have a meal, right? At one time it might have been $5. Today it might be $15 or $20, whatever it is. And we want to make sure that that's for at least 2 people. And we give Matanos Avoyim. We give Mishlach Manot, gifts, right? Gifts of food. Right? The idea of both of these things is an idea of unity, of peace among our people, of caring for our people. Right? And then finally, we have this huge feast. At the end of the...
You're right. Chabad is doing dinner.
So you're going there.
We're going.
Right. I thought so.
For the dinner. Yeah.
Right.
More than just a party. It's actual dinner. We're going to be sitting
down.
Right.
It's a
dinner.
whole event.
Yeah.
So, and there'll be l'chaim for sure.
Oh, that was definitely worried about.
Guaranteed.
Serious l'chaim.
Serious l'chaim. So, but you have a little wine is good. You know, if you have a doubt, you could maybe even bring a little of your own wine to make sure you have, because they may be serving more hard liquor than whatever. So you can take care of that. But the root of the gezerah, of the offense, of the edict against us, was two things: avodah zarah and this feast of Akatreris, that the Jews went to the feast, even though it was kosher. It was clearly intended as a compromising thing, and not a place where we should have been. So we decided to have our feast, right, on Purim, right, to compensate for that one. In terms of avodah zarah, right, very often the weakness of Jews, which leads to many problems, including avodah zarah, is divisions among ourselves. Is this kind of, you know, when you read the story of the Egel, of the golden calf, right? Okay. You see there's divisions among the people, you know, struggling with it. When you read the prophets, you see there's divisions. Should we do this? Should we do this? Right? The idea of Matanos Levoyim, of giving gifts to the poor, and the idea of Shalach Manot, of giving gifts of food, is about dining together, about being together, about sharing together, about recognizing we are a family, you know, that we are one family. It's I read a story, and maybe we'll close with this. It was a beautiful story that in the Israeli Defense Forces, they have a policy that anybody who wants, at the time of induction into the Israeli Defense Forces, can be tested for a bone marrow transplant. What's it about? Yeah. Bone marrow transplant is something that is very hard to match. People who are dying, heaven forbid, of leukemia, are dying because their white blood cells can't fight the cancer. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know all the details, but that's basically the principle. So, bone marrow is like stem cells, in that it can replace and regenerate where nothing else can. The problem is it has to be an exact match. Generally speaking, the matches people have are from relatives. It used to be quite a painful operation, apparently.
Really?
Right. Now it's
inside your bones?
Yeah. The marrow inside your bone. But now they actually seem to be able to take your blood and distill the marrow or the parts of the marrow that are in the blood without causing. It's no different than transfusion now.
Wow.
It's quite simple. But the problem is finding matches. And it turns out that the people who serve in the IDF, you know, they're very healthy young men and women. And if they choose to, they're providing very healthy systems. And there was a lot of controversy as to whether they should do this or not, because the IDF has its own, you know, it's its own huge bureaucracy, and you know, when are we getting into this? We're not in the bone marrow transplant business. You know? But there were a couple of individuals who were very, very dedicated that this should happen. And now it is by far the largest bone marrow data bank for Jews in the world. And these young men and women are saving the lives of Jews all over the world.
Wow.
Not just in Israel, right?
Because they can go and match from there.
Because the lesson of it is we are not simply a faith, and we are not simply a nation. We are primarily a family linked by blood.
Wow. And
a Jew that is in Pittsburgh, and a Jew that's in Vienna, and a Jew that's in Johannesburg, you know, and a Jew that's in Tel Aviv, and a Jew that's serving in the IDF have a great deal in common. Right down to their marrow of their bones. And the numbers are interesting. They said that the more elite, it's a volunteer thing, nobody has to do this. The more elite the unit, the higher the percentage of the people who volunteer.
They want to do it.
the closing point of the article was that they had a group of fighter pilot trainees who were inducted. 94% said we want to volunteer for this. So the IDF has become a lifesaver for Jews around the world and a lesson. And it is the lesson of Purim as well. It's the lesson of Matanos Levoyim. It's the lesson of Shalach Manot. It's the lesson of gathering together as one to hear the Megillah. It's the lesson of the Mishnah of the feast. Is it more than a religion and more than a nation? We are by blood a family right to our bone marrow, and that we should care for one another this way. I'd like to wish on behalf of KosherTube and myself, everybody, a Freilich Purim, kosher Purim, a happy Purim, a joyous Purim, a Purim of great fulfillment, and that we should see the defeat of our enemies and the rebuilding of the base of Mikdash.
Amen.
Amen.